Going live now to Leesburg, Virginia, where historian Jon Meacham is moderating a discussion with former President Jimmy Carter and former Vice President Walter Mondale. You see on your screen there, they'll be talking about human rights. This is hosted by the Carter Center.
Enormous amount of respect for each other, and the way that the fact that they're sort of getting to hang out today is a treat for both of them, I know. So thank you very much for that. Karen Ryan is the Senior Advisor for Human Rights and Special Representative on Women and Girls at the Carter Center. She has been at the Carter Center in various aspects since 1988, assisting on human rights issues. As I said, that human rights is sort of the heart and soul of the Carter Center in all of its respects, and Karen has really been the heart and soul of that human rights endeavors at the Carter Center throughout this time. So it's a giant treat to get to have Karen here, and I know that you've heard from her before. We also are blessed to have Jon Meacham here, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer, a contributor to Time, the New York Times Book Review. Those are print periodicals. He's a... Yeah, that is right. We're talking about the Carter administration. He's a professor at Vanderbilt University. He's from Chattanooga, and many of you may not know that there's a significant border dispute between Georgia and Tennessee. But we are proud today, at least, that he's from North Georgia, which is nice.
You're obviously not running this year.
Yeah, I'm not running in Tennessee, that's for sure. He is embarked on a project, in addition to the numerous books that he has written and that have been bestsellers and, again, Pulitzer Prize winners. He has last year published a book called The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. And that project, I think, belongs well in this group. Maybe better than introducing you to them, to introduce them to you, I'm going to introduce them to you, which is to say this is a group of people who share your desire to find out what it is and to remember what it is that our country is based on, and that soul is real. And we believe that the Carter Center has a special place there. Of course, my grandparents have been a part of that and have been peering as we can into the heart and soul of this country, into the issue of human rights forever. What we will do as we get ready for, he's ready for the spotlight again, that's what he wants. We're going to have a panel discussion, but as an introduction to it, there's a video that we're going to show very briefly that highlights the work of the human rights defenders that the Carter Center supports. As I said yesterday, the Carter Center has done its very best to focus not on ideals only, but on ideals as put into practice, and to support the people who on the ground every day, day in and day out, are fighting the battles for human rights in their own communities. And I think these examples are remarkable ones. You'll hear more about them, but I will show the video briefly about the Human Rights Defenders Program at the Carter Center, and then Jon Meacham will direct the rest of the panel. There'll be time for questions that have been pre-asked, so once we get there, we'll let them go for a while, and then we'll cut it off after we've had too many questions. How about that? But first, the video. Thank you all very much for being here. I'm excited about the panel.
I wish I could swim like dolphins can swim, though nothing will keep us together. We can beat them forever and ever. how we can be heroes just for one day. How we can be heroes just for one day. I will be king, and you will be queen. Though nothing will drive us away, how we can be heroes just for one day. How we can be us just for one day.
Right. Thank you all. As a Tennessean here, I am the diversity, and I appreciate it very much, but I think we should all be honest that the only reason we're here is because of Mrs. Carter. So thank you. I know it's the only reason you got this far. So I want to start with a little bit of what's happening right now. I'm interested, Mr. President, in your views of what's happening at the U.S.-Mexican border with the family separation and what your reaction to what we're seeing there and what you think ordinary Americans can do about it.
Well, every day we send a disgraceful signal around the world that this is what the President of the United States government stands for, and that is torture and kidnapping of little children, separation from their parents, and deprivation of those who are incarcerated. And there are thousands of unknown children that are still incarcerated that hasn't been revealed by the government itself. So I think what ICE is doing under the direct orders of the President is a disgrace to the United States, and I hope it'll soon be ended. Maybe not until the 2020 election, I'm not sure, but either then or before that, I hope it'll end as we change presidents.
And would it be just a basic political activism that you would advise people who are worried about it? Just get in and try to change the president?
I think if everyone in the United States would take the same position that the Carter Center does and promote human rights to the #1 basic measurement of how governments are performing on earth, that would be the best thing to do. So what we do is apply human rights in the finest and most precise way we can, and as fulfilling as we can to comply with the Universal Declaration. as is humanly possible. And if you apply the basic human rights standards to every incident that happens in international diplomacy and in everyday life, that would be the best thing for the United States to do. And I hope all Americans will take this on.
What would a Carter-Mondale administration, how would the administration have reacted to the murder by Saudi Arabia of Jamal Khashoggi?
I hope we would have, and I believe we would have demanded a complete accounting about how high up the orders came from concerning the direct murder of Khashoggi. As you know, they sent about 15 people to the embassy where Khashoggi was destined to be, was scheduled to be, and they apparently killed him, cut him up in little pieces, and buried him in some unknown place. And that was could only have been done under orders from some of the highest people in the government of Saudi Arabia. So I would demand an accounting for that. We tried when I was president to put human rights as a measuring stick in every instance. We didn't always succeed, but that's what our effort was.
One more off the top of the news, and then we'll dive in. Russia has been proven by our intelligence community to have interfered with one of our human rights, which is the right of free and fair elections. Yeah. What's your reaction? How should we deal with Russia?
Well, the president himself should condemn it, admit that it happened, which I think 16 of the intelligence agencies have already agreed to say. And there's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election. And I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered on his behalf.
So do you believe President Trump is an illegitimate president?
Based on what I just said, which I can't retract, I would say yes.
Thank you. Well, having made news, let's talk about Eleanor Roosevelt, which to me is news. Talk about your interest in human rights, given both your background in the segregated South and your international experience in the Navy heading into your public career.
Well, I grew up in a little village called Archery, Georgia, which had about 50 families, farm families. My family was the only one that was white. All the rest of them were African American. And so I grew up completely immersed in an African American culture, in a black culture. And I could see, as a little child even, that there was a great distinction between white and black people. My mother, by the way, was a registered nurse, and she never paid any attention to racial distinctions. She treated everybody the same in a very courageous way, but she was part of the medical establishment in Plains, which is very powerful. And so she was kind of impervious to condemnation or criticism. So I grew up in that environment. And then later I became chairman of the Board of Education in our county. And I demanded that the other 4 board members go with me to visit all the schools. And we found, and to see what actually was going there, we found that the black kids were going to school just as close as they could to where they lived because they didn't have any school buses. White kids had school buses, black kids didn't. And the African-American kids got the hand-down, worn-out textbooks in the inferior schools. Later, our own Board of Education insisted that African-Americans get school buses too. So when they finally got a few school buses, they painted the fenders of the ones carrying black children black, so everybody that saw the school buses carrying children would know this was being done in a silly, segregated way. So that's how I grew up in a culture that was completely segregated. And then I went into the Navy when I was 18 years old. I went through Naval ROTC at Georgia Tech and then went to the Naval Academy. And I eventually got into submarines. And I was in the submarine force in 1948 when Harry Truman, our commander-in-chief and president, and whom I still think is the best president who's lived since in my own lifetime. Anyway, Harry Truman ordained that racial segregation be abolished in all the military forces and in the civil service. And it went into effect because he was commander-in-chief and he commanded it. And so because of that, I saw a very easy transition on my submarine and on other ships around me, and how much benefit it brought to everybody in the attitude toward one another and treating fellow citizens and fellow naval men and officers equally. So that was a very good test 7 or 8 years before Martin Luther King became famous, and before Rosa Parks sat in the front seat of a bus. So 7 or 8 years earlier, Harry Truman was the one that broke the ice and actually started the desegregation of America.
Your religious upbringing must have been essential.
It was. Well, you know, I grew up also immersed in a church in Plains, a Baptist church. My father was a Sunday school teacher, and we went through the many parts of the Bible, particularly, I would say, the Sermon on the Mount in the fifth and sixth chapter of Matthew, where Jesus spells out the essence of what is presently known as universal human rights. He spelled out the proper relationship between the powerful and the weak, between the Jews and Gentiles, between men and women, and said that everybody should be treated equally. And that was the foundation of what Eleanor Roosevelt later did in evolving helping to evolve the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the only time in human history when the United States has gone to all the major religions and extracted the essence of what their primary moral and ethical values are and put them together in kind of lay terms, but also semi-legal terms, was in the development of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that has never happened before or since in history. And now I'm afraid that they are being basically abandoned in many ways, many of them around the world. The Carter Center is fighting against that abandonment, by the way, every day.
When you were running for president in 75 and 76, did you know that the human rights agenda would be as central to you if you got there?
Yes, I did. And I would say that when I became president and during my term, there was a general sigh of relief in America then. Well, finally, we have resolved the race issue. Yeah. We've gotten over, years of slavery and then 100 years of official and legal discrimination by white people against black people. And we kind of breathed a sigh of relief that we're finally out of that period. But lately, with the developments in the White House and other places, it's become a very burning issue again. And there's a great deal of discrimination and racial animosity that has evolved again or come to the forefront again. And one of the demonstrations of that is not only between African American and white people. We've seen that on television lately, and for a long time, as a matter of fact, but also at the border, where we assume that if somebody is trying to come to our country like my grandparents did many, many years ago, is inferior to those who are long established here like I am. So that discrimination against newcomers to our country just seeking relief from persecution is another indication of a serious human rights mistake in our country that is being promulgated worldwide, as I said earlier, to every country on earth. The human rights doesn't stand, the United States doesn't stand anymore for human rights. We are opposed to some basic human rights openly and without being embarrassed about it.
One of the things you hear, and I disagree with it, so I'll put my cards on the table, is when people say about the current moment, this is not who we are. It kind of is, right? It's this perennial tension. I mean, we're Southerners. Faulkner was right. The past is never dead. It isn't even past.
That's right.
And isn't it really, and when I look at your work, I think about you're an army on the right side of this in this perennial struggle between our better angels and our worst instincts. But it's never on this side of paradise going to be resolved. So is it fair to think, is there a benefit to the country to our being more honest about our worst instincts? That racism, xenophobia, isolationism, nativism are parts of the American character.
Yeah.
And our struggle is to make them ebb as opposed to flow.
Well, that certainly is a part of our political situation. And I think that the fact is that in the past, overcoming slavery and overcoming racial discrimination for 100 years, as I said earlier, after slavery was officially abolished, is a way for the United States to correct its long-standing mistakes. Sometimes it's not easy for us to do, and it takes a lot of altercation in our country. Luckily, this time, instead of having a civil war, we're having a war of political factions. And I would say that in general, the Democratic Party is now standing on the side of presenting what's the finest aspect of America concerning civil rights, at least, to the world. And I hope that our party will also continue to show that everybody in the United States and around the world is equal to everybody else, not only in the eyes of human beings, but also in the eyes of God.
Mr. Vice President, can I ask you, we talked about 1948, which in many ways is a huge inflection point in the formation of the human rights question. You had the Declaration with Mrs. Roosevelt. You had the breakup of the Democratic Party after your fellow Minnesotan said that the party had to walk out of the shadow of states' rights into the sunlight of civil rights, which sent Strom Thurmond back to the South pretty fast. Can you talk about your upbringing in Minnesota and how you were shaped in these questions? And when you signed on with President Carter, did you know this was a lifetime gig?
I do now. While our upbringings were different, there were a lot of similarities. My dad was a farmer and then a minister. He was a devout Methodist. He would give 3 sermons every Sunday morning.
3?
These little towns. And I would go to Sunday school, Wednesday night prayer, dinner, and then I would sweep and clean up the church. That was my religious leadership there. But I
wasn't bad preparation for the vice presidency.
Yeah, I was sweeping around there. Yeah. You're not being helpful today.
Sorry, sir. I'll be quiet now.
But even one of the things that I found most impressive about our years together was how much our backgrounds suited us to work together even without anybody briefing us. I mean, I think that even though Carter's background in the South was different, in fundamental ways it was very similar. We had 125 years without a Southern president until Jimmy Carter. And the difference was that he stood for civil rights. And one of the great contributions to human rights in our country and in the world was his personal courage, his and Rosalind's, in that small town in southern Georgia, standing up for civil rights when it was not the thing to do. And then going into the White House and speaking out for human rights and filling in the blanks of what America should do as a leader in the world in human rights. And it was my privilege over those 4 years to try to work with the president as he led us in this remarkable direction, which set a precedent, which is not perfectly complied with today, but it made a difference, which still has a big effect in the world.
When you think back, is there an example or two you would point us to as a case study about how we should be doing this?
Well, I thought the boat people issue was a good example of human rights leadership. The Vietnamese Communist government decided to push their citizens of Chinese ethnic origin out to sea on seaworthy boats. Many of them lost their life as a result. And President Carter tried to intervene in a positive way to provide an alternative for these boat people to live a decent life.
We were trying to admit 12,000 a month of refugees, you might say, from the Vietnam War.
Yeah, and we, you know, they had, a lot of them were drowning at sea, and we got the Navy to go out and pick these people up. It wasn't a very popular thing at the time, but I think it proved to be a great step forward, because the first thing these poor people in the boat saw were the American Navy trying to help them to save their lives and set them on a new way. I don't think they'll ever get over that, and that was Carter's leadership.
When you went up to the Hill to talk to your former colleagues about these kinds of issues, did they get it?
Some of them did. Some of them still haven't gotten it. No, but we had to work on it, but we had pretty good support on the Hill, I would say, in both parties. As one of the positive memories I have of that time, we spent a lot of time. The main thing is people are afraid of it. Senators are afraid of it. They'd say, you're right, I know you're right, but, you know, I got to get elected, and this is not going to be very popular. And I remember we got some of them, I can remember a couple of them, said, okay, I'm going to vote for you, but I'm going to lose the election, and I want President Carter to put me on the federal bench afterwards.
So it was a jobs program.
Yeah.
And a lot of them voted for us and lost.
Yes, they did.
Because of the votes.
But I figure 5 of them lost their seats voting for this.
What about Latin America, South America?
Well, I think this is maybe where we first proved the depth and the breadth of the president's program, and it began with the Panama Canal issue. You see, what's that got to do with human rights? Well, that was a symbol of sort of colonial rule. For 100 years or more, we'd run that place our way. We would employ the locals, but they had no role in the policy or the leadership of the program, management of the program. And the president went out and said, no, we're going to let the people of Panama run this program. We'll help them, and then we need the right to come back in if our security is imperiled. And you know what, that worked very well. It's working well now. And it wasn't going to work. I remember the general in charge of our troops down there said, there's no point in trying to stay on here with military force because there's so much anger about us that we can't do it. And so that's worked. It's been very successful. We had to go up on the Hill and lobby a lot and push a lot, but it got done.
That brought about profound changes, beneficial changes in Latin America. For instance, when Fritz and I got in office, I would say that at least 2/3 of the countries in South America were dictatorships, military dictatorships mostly. And all the previous presidents and administrations had been in bed with the military dictators. because they got benefits from iron ore and bauxite and bananas and pineapples and so forth. And the generals in charge would send their children to West Point, their boys to West Point, and so it was a close relationship. And I took the other way around and tried to implement human rights. And within 6 or 8 years, every country in South America was a democracy. Mm-hmm. So that was a profound and very rapid change from one form of government to another that the people down there brought about. We didn't do it.
One for you, and then we'll go to Dr. Ryan. We're watching around the world a rise of authoritarianism, nationalism. Given those threats, those challenges, what effect does that have on a human rights agenda? And again, what do you wish ordinary folks can do? What can they do to participate in trying to push back against that?
The Carter Center, under Karen Ryan's direction, has made a very thorough analysis of what's happened to human rights on a global basis as a result of 9/11, a horrible and unprovoked attack against the United States. And as a result of 9/11, and some of this is excusable, I guess, we've been in a war now for more than 15 years in Afghanistan. We have also greatly restricted the privacy of the average American citizen. Now, with laws that have been passed, they've changed. We have abandoned some of the basic principles of human rights promulgated in the Geneva Conventions, like not torture prisons. So in those ways, cumulatively, the would-be human rights violators in foreign countries that used to be restrained by America's restraint has had that restraint lifted, and they have become abusive more than they would have because the United States is no longer the example of a champion of human rights.
I think it's that, but I also think they see in the president a cheerleader for this right-wing surge that's occurring in the world. He openly loves the authoritarian leaders, has contempt for democratic leaders. His rhetoric, his harshness, his divisiveness, all of this is of a kind of a hateful, it's a hateful thrust. And we're going to the right as a result. I've never seen a Republican president in our lifetime do anything like that. It's not about party politics. He's got something deep in him that is detestable.
Is he a symptom or a cause?
I think he's both. He's sui generis. We've never had a person like that around, even near the White House. He's, doctors tell me that they think they recognize symptoms of psychological problems in him. You can almost predict now what he's going to do. It's going to be about him. It's going to celebrate him. He's going to be right and we're going to be wrong. No matter what goes on, that's what he does. There's some need in him to do that.
I think Prince has just stolen my headlines.
Let me put it this way. Jody would be having a hell of an afternoon. Dr. Ryan, take us to a high level here.
Well, first let me thank you for the PhD. That's the quickest PhD, quickest, easiest, and cheapest PhD ever in history. I don't have a PhD, so thank you for calling me Dr. Ryan. Just to go back to President Carter's remarks and to Vice President Mondale about the genesis, you know, President Carter, one of the things that he did, in his time, when he decided to make human rights the centerpiece, was to sign the United Nations human rights treaties. And before this time, there was a doctrine that said the U.S. should never submit its sovereignty or subject its sovereignty to the UN. And by signing those treaties, he said, we, the United States, will go on an equal basis. We will put ourselves on an equal basis with other nations on human rights. This was an extremely significant shift. His presidency also invested in the UN, a human rights office that became the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So this was an investment in the global norm development of human rights that President Carter and Walter Mondale both committed to and acted on. This is significant. And what was happening at the same time was the human rights movement. Amnesty International was given the Nobel Prize in 1977 during the Carter administration. There was really an upsurge of a human rights movement. President Carter and his administration injected that movement with energy, with moral support, morale. The other thing that he did when he sent Pat Darien and Mrs. Carter to Latin America, you mentioned Latin America, this was our hemisphere, yet he sent Pat Darien, the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, who was an amazing champion for human rights, and I see some of her colleagues, Roberta Cohen and Tex Harris and others that are here with us today, who brought that message to the dictatorships in Latin America. In fact, Pat threatened military support to Argentina if the disappeared people, the thousands of disappeared people, did not reappear. And they did. They reappeared alive because of that threat of withholding of military support. There's a professor in Georgia, in Atlanta, who's alive, who came and told us, I was one of those 3,000 that would have been dead if Pat Darien hadn't gone down and pounded her fist and said, we want to see these people alive. So by not just rhetoric, by real action, the Carter administration made such an important difference in Latin America. But you have to understand, this was during the Cold War. So not only did President Carter write a handwritten letter to Andrei Sakharov, the Soviet dissident, this was in a country that was an adversary. He held our allies to the same standard, at least in our hemisphere. He was able to hold our allies to that same standard and our own country. So what that did was that created a normative framework that was based on legitimacy and credibility, so that human rights activists around the world could really say human rights is a universal cause. We are part of something global. We are not agents of the West. We are not stooges for the Americans. We are part of a global movement. That continued, as President Carter said, until 9/11, when that trajectory of positive developments shifted to a negative trajectory because of torture, indefinite detention, assassination policy, et cetera. So, and the war in Iraq. So this is what we're dealing with now, is really reweaving the fabric of human rights throughout the world.
I remember, if I could bring up one issue, we were having trouble in South Africa. The apartheid, all-white, anti-black government were not going to let black Africans, their fellow citizens, be a part of the public process. And the president sent me to Geneva to meet with Vorster. That was a terrible assignment. And I spent 3 days debating with him about why his government should open up and get rid of discrimination. And he was a really bad actor. Maybe that's another story. Huh? But he had once praised Adolf Hitler. This was not good material. And we really pressed him. We didn't, in our time in office, we didn't get it done, but we started something there in Africa that did make a difference. They heard us. They saw we'd changed. And it encouraged citizens throughout Africa to believe that they too had a right to participate in the public life of their country. And a lot of progress occurred because of that example.
Mr. President?
Yeah, one other aspect of human rights that hasn't been mentioned yet is the right of people to live in peace. And unfortunately, not just under Trump, but for a long time, our country's been the foremost warlike country on earth. I had this in my Sunday school lesson a few Sundays ago, and I looked it up on Google. The United States has been a country now for about 242 years. We have been completely at peace 16 years. We have been at war with somebody 242 years. So that's another thing you ask about symptom or cause. I would say if the American people didn't feel that it was okay to go to war, you know, to bomb other people and so forth, in order to expand America's influence in global affairs, then we wouldn't do that, because most presidents look on going to war in a crisis as a way for them to change from a very beleaguered civilian administrator to the commander-in-chief.
Right.
And so going to war is popular in our country. And I think it's proven most vividly by those figures that I just gave you. 16 years out of 242 total.
Well, you and President Eisenhower.
Under our 4 years, we started no wars. We didn't shoot a gun at anybody. It was a time when we sought to find peaceful answers.
Do you believe that, it's been 40 years or so, one of the factors that is clearly shaping both governance and the lives of the governed is both the digital and almost the packaging of news as entertainment, as partisan entertainment? Sure. And some of this goes back. I mean, so Nightline begins during the hostage situation. So there's a very thin line there. Do you acknowledge what the I mean, what do you make of the point that we almost spend too much time engaged in ongoing partisan strife and not enough time thinking about the underlying questions?
Well, I think the gerrymandering and the massive infusion of money into politics because of its stupid citizens versus, United ruling. The Supreme Court has made two very serious mistakes lately, just one of them yesterday. And this has caused our country to change from, I've said this before, to change from a democracy to a theocracy, where money is a prevailing factor.
Oligarchy or theocracy?
Theocracy.
Theocracy.
Theocracy. Yeah, theocracy. And I would say that that this is I forgot what my comment was.
The money, the money becomes
the money infusion,
yeah.
and the gerrymandering of districts has meant that when a person is running for office, they have to see how much money they can raise, and when they get in office, whether they're Democratic or Republican, they then want to, show some favor to the people that helped them to get in office. So it's become now a matter of our country not responding to the average working people in our country, but to the richest and most powerful already.
Did the Supreme Court yesterday rule that local governments could redesign their districts without appeal to the higher courts? Did I understand that?
Yeah.
Because that's going to open up more and more of these manipulation of districts and frustration of...
They basically declare the partisan gerrymandering, and it is Gary, by the way. The only thing we know about Elbridge Gary is that he drew that district. That's the only reason he's involved, and we don't pronounce his name right. It drives me crazy. I am, in fact, the only person who cares, including the Gary family. But anyway, it threw out the 14th Amendment argument that partisan gerrymandering violated due process, equal protection.
See, that's going to be real trouble.
It's going to be serious.
And that's a case of technology. I remember covering the Georgia redistricting in the 1990 or so, and they had these big pieces of paper, and now you can go in and pick out one house, you know, and just, and you have, and there's no incentive for compromise, right?
No.
No political incentive. Let me ask two questions, if I may, from the audience. This is from Ross Cooper for President Carter. What steps should a new president take immediately to restore the moral authority of the United States on human rights?
This president or? A
new president.
A new president.
And if you want to make any predictions on that, I think we're here.
No prediction. But I go with what the recent participants in the Democratic debates have said. Almost all of them say they would immediately countermand all the orders that the president has issued concerning the border affairs, but also to announce that we're going to re-enter the Paris Accords as full participants in preventing global warming becoming a crisis, and also that we're going to participate with other countries in other aspects of human rights. So I would say that those would be the first things that you can do with executive order.
Right.
Because a lot of what Trump has done that has damaged our country's reputation is just by executive order, of which he's very proud, you know.
Right. Oh, yes. That signature, yeah. Dr. Ryan, I'm just going to stick with that. It's very Tom Clancy. I don't know why you're upset. What do you consider the most significant U.S. federal human rights achievement in the past 30 years?
U.S. federal? You mean within the U.S. or globally?
This is Alicia Smith. You want to amend your question?
Well, I would say globally, the U.S. until 9/11 was assisting human rights champions all over the world in ways you might not know about, with funding, with support, with moral support. And that continues despite the difficulties. You know, a few days ago, there was an election in Istanbul, and Erdogan's party lost the second round. And I think this is an indication that the human rights movements, democracy movements, are still there. They're not going to be deterred. We're going to win this over time. But the issue we have to ask ourselves is, what can we do now? And the United States, I would say, I would look to the next administration, if this administration isn't willing to do it, to fund human rights activists directly, fund democratic movements and peace builders who are out there trying to make peace in the trenches. And this is a philosophy of the Carter Center, is that we believe that people can solve their own problems if we go into partnership with them. And we recognize that it's their societies to fix. We have to do our part. We just have to stop waging war, and we have to stop really abusing the power that we have in negative ways. That's important. We have immense power. We have to use it correctly. And if we do, we will make a huge difference, both in peace and in human rights.
Mr. Vice President, if a young senator came to you and said, what's the most important piece of advice you can give me, what would you say?
Provide leadership for the moral dimension of government.
The moral dimension.
Yeah. Let's be heard on human rights. Let's be heard on justice. Let's be heard on fairness. Let's be heard on those issues that can disappear unless they have champions. A single senator, if they get involved and work on issues, can make a big difference. There are very few offices where that can be said. The presidency, of course. The House, less so, because you have so many numbers there. The numbers are so many. But in the Senate, a senator can make a big difference.
Like Hubert Humphrey.
Yeah. I had another senator in mind, but...
But as Mark Twain said, he became vice president and was never heard from again. Mr. President, so I'm going to use a biblical analogy. It's been 40 years. So like Moses, do you have a song for us? What's a kind of benediction for what the country, what the world could be doing, should be doing?
Well, I happen to be a Christian, and I would say follow the principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And I don't see any distinction between the two. They seem to be quite compatible to me. And other great religions, Islam and Judaism and so forth, they have their moral and ethical standards, and I think that they are all compatible with the basic principles of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights.
Well, thank you all. One of the things that I've always admired about President Carter is the epigraph to "Why Not the Best" is from Reinhold Niebuhr. Can you quote it?
The sad duty of politics is to establish justice in a sinful world.
In a sinful world. And very few Americans of this or any generation have done as much to fulfill that duty as you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.